Battling T.C. Campbell was great for Taft's career. He was born with a wealth of family connections, but after helping Congressman Butterworth get back into Congress and helping him get revenge on T.C. Campbell, Butterworth took Will Taft under his wing, hosting him in his Washington home and taking him around the Capitol to introduce him to other congressmen and senators. His younger brother and roommate Horace joked about Will's name-dropping when he started to refer to some of the nation's most prominent legislators as friends. He also, of course, cemented and built allegiances with the anti-Campbell wing of the local Republican Party. Rufus Smith worked closely with Taft when Smith prosecuted Campbell's first criminal bribery case. And when he was elected county solicitor, he made Taft assistant county solicitor, a guaranteed lucrative, steady source of side work for the next 3 years. Although, Taft left the position when he got a better offer. Joseph Foraker was a close friend and ally of T.C. Campbell. He defended him in his first bribery trial, the one that Smith prosecuted, and he was supposed to defend him in his disbarment trial. But as affiliation with T.C. Campbell grew more toxic, and Foraker's chances of being nominated to run for governor were coalescing, Foraker abandoned his old friend. Will Taft said a lot of nasty things about Foraker when he stood at Campbell's side, but when he left him out in the cold, stabbed his old friend in the back, Taft saw it as a moment of great moral redemption. Although Campbell ultimately emerged victorious from all of his trials and tribulations, his enemies wrecked the value of his political brand. And at the same time, Taft's luster and power increased. Taft's brother Charlie owned and edited the Time-Star, which was another local Republican-leaning newspaper, and it grew in influence. And although he was officially just a diplomat at this point, their father, Alphonso Taft, still wielded a lot of influence. So partly in battling T.C. Campbell and attacking him for the corrupt influence he and his newspaper-owning friend were able to exert, the Taft boys were actually forming a very similar power base. Collectively, the Taft family was starting to become a political dynasty that aspiring politicians needed to cozy up to. That included Joseph Foraker, and after he became governor of Ohio in 1887, he appointed Taft to an open seat on Hamilton County's Superior Court. It was a good gig. Taft was only 30 years old and had been a lawyer for less than 7 years at that point. But on the bench, he earned Republican accolades for his conservative decisions. He gained a reputation as a solidly anti-labor jurist, establishing legal precedent that barred unions from using organized boycotts as a tool of persuasion during strikes. He won re-election to the seat in 1888, but he felt that he was ready now, at age 31, to ascend to his dream job. And he asked Governor Foraker to push President Benjamin Harrison into appointing him to fill an open seat on the U.S. Supreme Court. Concerned with Taft's youth and inexperience, Harrison declined to do this. But a year later, he offered Taft the position of United States Solicitor General. Although, Taft wound up not spending that much time in that job either. In March 1891, just 13 months later, Congress created an additional judgeship in all of the federal circuit courts of appeal, and President Harrison appointed Taft to the Sixth Circuit, which was based in Cincinnati. So Taft went back home to Cincinnati as a federal appeals court judge, And he was in this role when the Pullman strike happened in Chicago in 1894. Pullman made and operated luxury railroad cars. There was a financial panic in America in 1893 that led to a depression. The depression caused new orders for Pullman railroad cars to plummet. Pullman responded by laying off thousands of workers and cutting pay for most of the remaining workers by 25 to 50%, which is a hell of a cut in your pay. Many of these workers also lived in Pullman, Illinois, which was a small suburb of Chicago entirely built, owned, and operated by the Pullman Company. Aside from the corporate paternalism of a company town, Pullman was a really kind of nice place to live. Although rent there was roughly 20 to 25% higher than surrounding communities. And so because of the cut in their pay, also because rent was kind of expensive, the Pullman workers who lived in Pullman asked for a reduction in rent to correspond with their reduction in pay. This wasn't a crazy ask, because due to payroll and other cost cuts, the Pullman Company was actually doing pretty well in 1894, despite the loss of business. But George Pullman, the millionaire head of the company, refused to even consider the idea of reducing rents. The result was that many of his employees were literally starting to have to choose between food or shelter for their families. So 3,000 of his workers went on strike. Due to the organization of the American Railroad Union, led by Eugene Debs, the strike was better organized than a lot of earlier 19th century strikes. It was both more peaceful and it was more tactical. Debs threatened a boycott of Pullman trains nationwide. Railroad workers all across the U.S. would refuse to move trains until Pullman cars were decoupled and removed from the trains. When Pullman still, despite this threat, refused to even consider negotiation, 150,000 railroad workers across the United States joined the boycott. Instead of negotiating, Pullman asked for the help of President Cleveland. In turn, Cleveland dispatched Attorney General Olney to handle the situation. And this was an obvious problem for the workers. While he was serving as U.S. Attorney General, Olney was allowed to keep his side hustle as legal counsel for the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy railroads. Well, I think it's a big problem to let a U.S. Attorney General hold a side hustle in general, but this one in particular was problematic. Olney made $8,000 a year as Attorney General, but he made $10,000 a year on his supposed side job for the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy railroads. So the idea that this guy was going to be neutral in a dispute involving the profit margins of railroads was absolutely ludicrous. Although the strike had been peaceful, Cleveland sent only 1,936 federal U.S. Army troops. Although they were supposed to be there as neutral peacekeepers, they were housed inside the Pullman factory, and it quickly became apparent that they were the federal government effectively acting as an extension of the Pullman Company's interest. only then got the U.S. Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, very conservative court, to grant an injunction that effectively placed a national ban on participating in the boycott or exercising free speech to encourage other people to join it. It was, in my humble opinion, absolutely unconstitutional as hell. But it nevertheless was enforced by other courts. Now, up to this point in the Pullman strike, William Howard Taft, who was on the Sixth Circuit, not the Seventh Circuit, didn't have anything to do with any of this. But then Eugene Debs sent a union spokesman named Frank Phelan to Cincinnati to encourage railroad workers to participate in the strike and the boycott. Phelan was arrested for violating the nationwide injunction that prohibited him from encouraging other people to join the effort. And he was brought in front of Judge William Howard Taft to determine whether or not he was in contempt of court. Now, we're telling you this side tangent story because it winds up giving us an incredible insight into what William Howard Taft learned, and far, far more importantly, what the future president and Supreme Court Justice of the United States did not learn about the Cincinnati National Guard Massacre while he was busy persecuting T.C. Campbell. As the prosecutions of T.C. Campbell catapulted Taft's political ascent, it also really helped him with his love life. In 1884, he was pursuing the affection of Helen Herron, who went by Nellie. Now, Nellie was petite and pretty, and like Taft's mother, she was extremely intelligent and a bit outspoken for an upper-class 19th century woman. Nellie, at first, wasn't really into Taft. There's an argument to be made she never was. But when he started receiving a lot of accolades during the Campbell trials, she began seeing him in a different light. And she told her mother, quote, "A lot of people think a great deal of Will. Some people say that he may obtain some very important position in Washington," unquote. And this impressed her, and it influenced her decision to accept his marriage proposal. So in a way, Campbell helped get him married. And by 1894, Taft and Nellie had several kids, a big pile of money, and a vacation home in Quebec, Canada. The Phelan case delayed Taft's planned departure with the rest of his family to go to Quebec for the summer. And he and Nellie wrote back and forth a lot while they were separated during this time. And in this correspondence, you see Taft sharing his unvarnished thoughts with his wife. Taft called the Pullman strike outrageous, and he said that he would be extremely disappointed if George Pullman negotiated at all with the strikers, all of whom he dismissed as, quote, demagogues and populists, unquote. He believed that sending almost 2,000 Army troops to Chicago to intimidate the strikers and enforce the injunction would have, quote, a wholesome effect, unquote. As it turned out, it did not have a wholesome effect. It caused tempers to flare, which was exacerbated when Illinois Governor Altgeld called up 4,000 members of the Illinois National Guard. Now, before things became violent, Taft wrote Nellie, quote, It will be necessary for the military to kill some of the mob before the trouble can be stayed, unquote. And shortly after he wrote these words, an agent of the Illinois Central Railroad shot 2 strikers. In response, 6,000 to 7,000 strikers set fire to a bunch of railroad cars, causing extensive and very expensive amount of damage. Taft then told Nellie, quote, "The situation in Chicago is very alarming and distressing, and until they have had much bloodletting, it will not get better. Word comes tonight that 30 men have been killed by the federal troops. Though it is a bloody business, everybody hopes it is true," unquote. Let me repeat that for a second. Not that it was tragic, not the bloodletting is horrible. Taft said, though it is a bloody business, everybody hopes that it is true. No, it wasn't true. It wasn't accurate. But Illinois National Guard troops did shoot over 100 rounds randomly into a crowd that was throwing rocks. And they killed and wounded over 20 people in the process. Rather than being mortified by this, Taft expressed his disappointment at the low death count. It wasn't the 30 that he had been told. He ended a letter to his wife with the cold-blooded, disconnected, quote, "They have only killed 6 of the mob as yet. This is hardly enough to make an impression. Good night, darling. Kiss the dear children," unquote. At the time that they were having this exchange of correspondence, their conversation fluctuated between how many starving workers would need to die at the hands of American soldiers until the good guys, meaning the rich railroad executives, could win. Fluctuated between that and Nellie's harrowing travails getting the proper curtains hung in their Canadian vacation house. Taft, of course, found feeling guilty of contempt and had him locked up, to the shock and surprise of absolutely no one. He said that he realized that this could cause a riot in Cincinnati, but he said that he couldn't help it. If it did, it would be entirely the fault of the, quote, "socialist and labor agitators," unquote. Ultimately, the overwhelming numbers and firepower of the U.S. Army troops and National Guardsmen who were deployed to Chicago ended the strike. They did it, shooting 12 people to death in the process. And while William Howard Taft was busy in Cincinnati in 1884, trying to place all the blame of the death and destruction of the courthouse riot on the shoulders of T.C. Campbell, the only lesson that he seems to have learned was that political unrest required more troops, more shooting, more bloodletting. And in his single-minded white whale quest to take down T.C. Campbell, in his blindedness and his inability to see the big picture and the real waste of life, the tragedy of it all, he not only failed to learn anything, he also helped deprive the rest of the country from learning anything useful either. I'm Mike Morgan, a writer, attorney, historian, and I will absolutely murder a good plate of Quebecois poutine.
I'm Amy Morgan. I am also an attorney. I enjoy history, but I'm really more of a true crime and politics junkie, and I'm helping tell the story because it involves all of those things.
And this is Truth Deferred, Season 1, The National Guard Massacre. A true story about biased media, corruption, murder, a slaughter of unarmed civilians by National Guard troops, and the cover-up that followed. A cover-up which hid the truth so well that this is the first time it's being told.
Unlike a grand jury, the role of the coroner's inquest was to find the cause of death for everybody killed during the courthouse riot. And that was more than just the physical cause. It was also assessing culpability. Who killed this person? How? And was it a crime?
Unfortunately, although it would drag on for months too long with shockingly useless results, the coroner's inquest officially began on the same day that the special grand jury deliberations started. As a result, that permitted Coroner Muscroft to announce that he would, quote, not make a searching investigation, leaving that to be done by a special grand jury, unquote. But as we have just discussed, the special grand jury was prohibited from even asking whether the National Guard had any liability for any of the deaths. So, which of these two bodies, the special grand jury or the coroner's inquest, would explore and assess culpability for the lives taken in an unbiased fashion, including answering whether the National Guard used grossly excessive force? Which one? Neither one.
Completely ducking these questions avoided a political problem. County and city government was almost entirely controlled by Democrats, and Governor Hoadley was a Democrat as well. The problem wasn't that they were Democrats versus Republicans. The problem was that it was a uniparty government. Everybody in power was aligned by party machines to protect everybody else in charge. Coroner Muscroft, a loyal Democrat up for re-election soon, was not going to run an investigation that was likely to raise uncomfortable questions about the decisions made by Sheriff Hawkins or Governor Hoadley, and by extension, any of the National Guard troops who were operating under their orders, nor inquire into the complete non-action of Mayor Stevens.
But despite Coroner Muscroft's best efforts, the hearings couldn't help but reveal inconvenient truths. On the first day of testimony, witnesses were all asked a series of consistent questions, including what the dead man's plans had been the last time they saw him. This revealed that some of the victims were running errands, some were going to visit friends, some were going to work when shot and killed. Curiosity drove others to watch the fire. Cincinnati police officer Joseph Strum was on duty when he was shot, doing his job. None of them were armed revolutionary socialists. In the words of the Evening Post, the testimony was showing that, quote, with one possible exception, the subjects were going quietly about their business or standing in the crowd looking on at the excitement, unquote. They were either entirely innocent or, at most, guilty of curiosity.
Mrs. Joseph Fagan, for example, testified that her husband literally didn't even know what hit him. After dinner, he left for the mill where he worked, something that he often did in the evening. Walking alone and away from the crowd down Main Street, He fell to the ground, confused. He'd been shot. Fagan lived long enough to tell his story, but died in the hospital.
18-year-old Andrew Sanger worked with his brother-in-law at a shop on Main Street. His sister testified that shortly before Andrew was shot dead, he and her husband dropped by her home to get their overcoats and to assure her that they were safe and that they were not caught up in the disturbance in any way.
There were a few exceptions. Henry Cates was trying to storm the tunnel into the jail basement when a guardsman shot him, although he was only armed with a lunchbox. One man died of a heart attack, and a few were killed while trying to loot Powell's gun shop, but these exceptions were rare. Generally, 2 solid days, people dressed in deep mourning garb recounted how husbands, sons, brothers, and friends were engaged in completely innocuous behavior when they were shot dead. These were inconvenient truths for a public official who clearly wanted to help justify the shootings. The inquest was supposed to examine the death of 13 people every day until the work was concluded, which was expected to happen by May. That was an ambitious schedule, but when Coroner Muscroft saw what evidence he was soliciting, he abruptly stopped the hearings after the second day and took a 6-day break.
During the break in ordinary proceedings, Muscroft called Ohio National Guard Quartermaster General Michael Ryan to the stand. Ryan's role straddled professional National Guard service with being a member of Governor Hoadley's staff. He was the governor's liaison and coordinator with National Guard Command, serving a role that we would probably call public relations today. Coroner Muscroft gave Ryan the witness stand, but he wasn't actually a witness because, unlike every witness, he did not have to take an oath to tell the truth. And he did not have to speak under threat of perjury. There were no ramifications for anything he said, even if he was intentionally lying. And whether it was intentional or not, he relayed a combination of spin and untruths, recounting how heroic 14th Regiment had marched from the train station to the courthouse, demonstrating almost superhuman restraint in the face of an abusive mob and overwhelming odds. They only resorted to gunfire as, quote, the last resource in the face of imminent peril, unquote. Although Ryan claimed that they had held their fire until the last resort, he only described a crowd that was angry and shouting insults. However, he said that when the brave heroes of the 14th Regiment began shooting the crowd, quote, a wild, desultory firing was kept up by the crowd, and many soldiers were wounded, unquote. Now, the biggest problem with this story was that the National Guard medics kept complete stats of injuries. So, in addition to Ryan's story contradicting basically every eyewitness, the Guard's own data proved that he was lying. But since he wasn't under oath and no one was permitted to cross-examine him, it didn't matter.
Ryan did make some backhanded concessions to the dead and offered a ridiculous explanation for the testimony that Coroner Muscroft had been eliciting, saying that, quote, a majority of those who met their death or were fatally wounded on that awful night were hitherto harmless creatures, while the real scoundrels who brought about this state of affairs and lit the incendiary torch escaped without injury. He didn't bother trying to explain how all the gun-wielding domestic terrorists dodged bullets, just saying that, quote, on occasions of this sort, it is scarce possible to save the wrong men from getting shot, unquote. Nevertheless, he insisted that what he called the Little Red Devils had justified all of the killing. Now, if we can relate back to the first episode for a minute, we told you that Cincinnati was the 8th largest city in the country at the time. Still culturally and politically relevant, but also that it wasn't on the cutting edge of any 1880s political movement. It was, as a whole, decidedly moderate. It did not have the vocal socialist or anarchist groups that were demonized in Chicago or New York at this time.
Cincinnati probably didn't have enough avowed socialists to populate a happy hour. But they were, to Ryan, nevertheless largely to blame. Much more so than the rich who formed the music hall meeting or the National Guard who actually shot everybody. But Ryan also wanted to contribute to the narrative that was being pushed by the indictments that Prosecutor Pugh had decided to pursue from the special grand jury, and the allegations being made by the Cincinnati Bar Association. Without calling him out by name, Quartermaster General Ryan put most of the blame on T.C. Campbell and looked for the silver lining in all of the death, injury, and destruction, philosophically concluding that if all the death could, quote, purify our courts, then perhaps, after all, in years to come, we may have occasion to look back upon this awful disaster as only a blessing in disguise, unquote. In other words, if you'd just lost your father or your brother or your friend, you had to realize that it's necessary to crack a few eggs to make an omelet. And as long as T.C. Campbell got neutered in the end, it would all be worth it.
When Coroner Muscroft resumed regular testimony, rather than starting hearings at 10 a.m., he started them at 2:30 p.m. And when witness after witness continued to describe honest, hard-working, decent people with families getting shot down in the street without warning while running errands or watching a fire, Muscroft responded with inconsistent questioning, short hours, and frequent pauses in the inquest, dragging the work on as slowly as possible.
Both the Cincinnati Commercial Gazette and the Evening Post became increasingly critical of the slow pace of the inquest. Both also accused the Democratic-leaning Cincinnati Enquirer of helping bury the truth by slow-walking it. And they clearly had a point. Even the right-wing Commercial Gazette wrote that claiming that, quote, the military saved the city from a communist mob is evidently and absurdly untrue, unquote. Both publications accused Coroner Muscroft of doing everything in his power to protect his Democratic allies from scrutiny or criticism by rewriting history. And as equally partisan as the commercial's motives were, Murat Halstead and his paper were really right. A massive whitewash and cover-up was occurring in plain sight.
Part of it involved solidifying a narrative around what happened to Captain John J. Desmond and putting to rest any doubt that he was killed by a rioter rather than the uncontrolled gunfire of his fellow troops. Muscroft called Corporal H.C. Williams of Desmond's 1st Regiment to tell a supposed first-hand account of Desmond's death. Williams told a harrowing story about how he and Desmond engaged in a fierce gun battle with rioters inside the courthouse. He said that bullets were flying fast when Desmond was shot between the eyes by an Enfield rifle. Williams specified the rifle type based on the ammunition that it used and, by extension, how it left a different type of wound than a Springfield rifle, which was the standard issued weapon of the Ohio National Guard. It was an incredible story and removed any doubt or possibility that Desmond had been killed by friendly fire. And the Cincinnati Enquirer said this was the first time the story of Captain Desmond's death was told correctly. And if it was true, this was an understatement.
There were were a lot of problems with the story, starting with the wound and what was passed off as ballistics evidence. Coroner Muscroft let Corporal Williams testify to where Desmond had been shot in the head and what the entry and exit wounds looked like. First, the coroner did this instead of doing an autopsy or even examining the wound and taking notes before Desmond was put into a closed casket and buried. And the corporal's description of the wound directly and radically contradicted other people who had seen it. Secondly, he made the leap of logic that because the wound looked like it did, it was ragged rather than clean, it could not have come from a Springfield rifle, and therefore could not have possibly been fired by a National Guardsman. The problem with this logic was that in another part of his testimony, Williams said that due to a shortage of Springfield rifles, Captain Desmond himself was not carrying a Springfield. Like many of his fellow troops, he had some other form of rifle that he had borrowed or brought from home, like an Enfield, maybe. But far more important than any of this parsing of the wound or the faulty logic, if this was the first time that the story was being told correctly, it was because it had been told many different times by different people from different vantage points, and nobody had ever told a story that even remotely resembled this one. Prior to Williams's testimony, whether you believed that Desmond was killed by friendly fire or by a rioter was largely based on whether you believed that he was standing in the doorway of the courthouse or he was standing in the street beside it when he was shot. Nobody except Williams seemed to remember a fierce gun battle. And although there were reports of pistols and shotguns in the crowd at the time, there were no known reports of rifles. And if this rioter had an Enfield rifle and was targeting National Guardsmen with it, why did he only shoot Desmond? And after getting by with it scot-free, where did he go? And why did not one other person in a crowd of thousands see him? Nevertheless, because this was the only version of events on the record during the coroner's inquest, and because the special grand jury, which was prohibited from considering the National Guard as committing any wrongful act, didn't indict anybody, this would become the formal, official version of what happened to the sole martyr of the courthouse riot, Captain John J. Desmond.
The verdict of the coroner's inquest was expected in May, but it was not released until July 12th, shortly before the Democratic political convention that would nominate candidates for the upcoming fall elections. It was an audacious document.
Fred Schmalz, who was executed on Sunday, March 30, for standing unarmed in protest against soldiers pointing guns at children, was the only death that Coroner Muscroft said that he could, quote, attach any blame, unquote, to the National Guard. Schmalz was the lone example of excessive force, although Muscroft didn't think anybody should be held accountable for it.
Cincinnati police officer Fred Strum was killed in the line of duty, but he was just a casualty of the National Guard acting appropriately.
Desmond was murdered by the mob, of course, and Private Israel Getz died from, quote, an accident caused by the falling of his gun, unquote. The wording being careful to avoid blaming either Getz or another soldier. In Muscroft's tortured syntax, the gun did it.
3 men were shot while attempting to loot Powell's gun store, which were probably the only truly accurate verdicts, aside from a man who died of a heart attack when the bullets started flying around him.
As to everyone else that died on Friday night, Muscroft ruled that they, quote, were violators of the law and were shot after being repeatedly warned by Sheriff Hawkins that further hostilities would be at the risk of their lives, unquote. In addition to blaming all of the victims, Muscroft rewrote history to say that Sheriff Hawkins had complied with a law requiring him to read the Riot Act, meaning that he had warned the crowd before deadly force was used, although nobody seems to have heard or remembered that happening.
As for Saturday, Muscroft was even more harsh, concluding that many of the dead were engaged in more unlawful and outrageous conduct than the people killed on Friday. Their actions were, quote, the fruit of vicious minds and engaged in by lawless and, in many respects, worthless men, unquote. He admitted that not all of them were actively evil. Some died, he said, quote, solely due to their own carelessness.
But Coroner Muscroft didn't stop with this, calling the dead worthless. He added for good measure, quote, I will further add that in almost every instance, the appearance of the various victims gave evidence that they were members of not the better class of society. And in the majority of those whose nativity I could discover, they were of foreign birth.
This included Ben Fink, the 41-year-old shoemaker who was walking home from work.
It included Henry Powers, the 23-year-old horseshoer who was walking over a block away.
It includes Johnny Schmidt, the 14-year-old boy that pleaded with his mother to be permitted to go watch the fire and was returned to her with a bullet through his head, and dozens of others.
A lot of people were, correctly, outraged by the verdict. But a shocking number were not, and swallowed all of it. To many, Muscroft's verdict justified what they had assumed all along. Shortly after the riot, for example, William Howard Taft wrote, quote, the Germans were the nucleus of the mob.
And the Cincinnati Enquirer, trying to protect its fellow Democrats, said that the verdict, quote, gives evidence of careful consideration of the various cases, unquote. And the rest of the nation had moved on. By July 1884, America had lost whatever first-hand recollection it had of the news during and immediately after the end of March. And Coroner Muscroft's findings were printed and reprinted and regurgitated all over the nation as the official facts of what happened.
And in the months and years that followed, people increasingly quit asking whether there was an alternative reality. A reality that reflected what had actually happened. And the courthouse riot became a story about a vicious, murderous, unruly mob sent into a frenzy over a corrupt verdict, who became so hell-bent on criminality that they had to be put down by the brave heroes of the Ohio National Guard. In the end, all of the culpability were useless men, most of them immigrants. That's it for now. Special thanks to Grab Bag Collab Network for their help on this podcast. And please check out grabbagcollab.com for more podcasts that we think you're really going to love. And additional thanks to our producer and director, Dan Fennessy. We will see you guys next episode.
See you next time.